US forces have fired on a ship that, according to President Trump, came from Venezuela and was loaded with drugs. 11 people were killed in the attack. The Venezuelan president responded, "This is the greatest threat to our continent in the last 100 years. An invasion would result in total war across the entire continent." Why have Venezuela and the US become such bitter enemies? Tensions have been running high in the recent weeks after the US military presence in the Caribbean was stepped up. In the first 100 days of his second term, Trump signed a decree designating 8 criminal groups from Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations. Now he seems to have set his sights on Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Trump is offering a $50 million reward for information leading to Maduro's arrest. Maduro is accused of collaborating with Tren de Aragua and the Mexican Sinaloa cartel and is said to be the head of El Cartel de los Soles, Spanish for the Cartel of the Suns. According to Trump, this cartel is flowing the US with deadly drugs in order to destabilize the country. Maduro denies the existence of the cartel. There are also dissenting voices in the US. The US National Intelligence Council, for example, writes that the gangs are not controlled by Maduro. Left-wing and right-wing governments in the region are diametrically opposed to each other. Countries with right-wing governments, such as Argentina, Paraguay, and Ecuador, support Trump's accusations. Increasing American pressure is giving Maduro the room to step up repression in his own country. He is calling on people to enlist in the armed forces. Maduro is portraying himself as a victim in order to rally the population against an external enemy. In recent weeks, he has called on people to support the fatherland in the fight against American imperialism. But Venezuela was never always so opposed to the United States. Venezuela gained its independence from Spain in the early 19th century. It spent some time in the Latin American superstate named Gran Colombia but seceded from it in 1830. Venezuela passed through an era of government by force with military dictators and civil wars that lasted for over a century. From the first decade of the 20th century till 1935, Venezuela was under the rule of Juan Vicente Gómez. He ruled as a brutal dictator and focused on modernization of his country. After Gómez's death in 1935, he was succeeded by Aliesa López Contreras. He had been a longtime supporter of Gómez. A transition was set in motion from dictatorial to democratic rule. The idea was to transfer power from the military to civilians. Venezuela had an abundant supply of oil and thus it had gained the interest of big powers throughout the years. Due to its geographical location, Venezuela sided with the Allied powers during World War II. Venezuela decided that it would outwardly remain neutral, but in reality sided with the United States. Venezuela's pro-US policy was thanks to the improved relations with the United States. US firms had a dominance of the petroleum of the country. Venezuela could have expropriated the US companies in the country, but that would trigger a US intervention. And the US was no stranger to interventions to its southern neighbors. Initially, the war had a negative impact on the Venezuelan economy because of European markets were cut off. Yet the country managed to make a deal with the US. However, its oil economy proved to be fragile as Germany attacked several of its tankers. Yet as the war continued, Venezuela's oil income increased and continued to increase in the years after the war. This allowed the country to finance and carry out significant modernization programs in the post-war period. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela and the United States maintained close ties. largely centered on oil. Venezuela, one of the world's largest petroleum exporters, sold most of its crude oil to US refineries, and American companies invested heavily in the Venezuelan energy sector. Politically, the countries were not always in perfect alignment, but they generally cooperated. During the Cold War, Venezuela was considered a relatively stable democracy in a region marred by coups and revolutions, and it aligned with US interests in containing communism. The turning point came with the election of Hugo Chávez in 1998. Chavez, a former military officer who had attempted a coup in 1992, campaigned on a populist socialist platform known as the Bolivarian Revolution, referring to the South American independence fighter Simón Bolívar. The rise of Chavez coincided with declining trust in the US across Latin America, and he positioned himself as a vocal critic of American influence. Chavez accused Washington of exploiting Latin America, condemning neoliberal economic policies promoted by US-backed institutions like the IMF, and built alliances with countries such as Cuba, Iran, and later Russia and China. When I visited Venezuela in the summer of 2024, there were many mural paintings showing Venezuela's recent allies. Relations between the US and Venezuela further soured in 2002, when Chavez briefly lost power in a coup attempt. Although Washington denied involvement, many in Venezuela believed the US tacitly supported the coup plotters. The incident cemented Chavez's distrust of the US, and it became a cornerstone of his anti-imperialist rhetoric. He began nationalizing industries, including oil assets controlled by US companies, and used Venezuela's oil wealth to fund regional initiatives like PetroCaribe, which provided cheap fuel to Caribbean and Latin American countries, often in exchange for political loyalty. The US in turn criticized Chavez for eroding democratic institutions, silencing opposition media, and centralizing power. While oil exports to the US continued, the political relationship grew openly hostile. Chavez famously called George W. Bush the devil in a 2000 United Nations speech, a symbol of the deepening divide.
I think that the first people who should read this book are our brothers and sisters in the United States. The devil is right at home. The devil himself is right in the house. And the devil came here yesterday. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, from this rostrum, the President of the United States, the gentleman to whom I refer as the devil, came here.
After Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolás Maduro took power and inherited both the Bolivarian project and Venezuela's deepening economic troubles. Falling oil prices devastated government revenues, and years of corruption and mismanagement led to hyperinflation, food and medicine shortages, and the mass immigration of millions of Venezuelans. The US responded by increasing sanctions. Tensions peaked after the 2018 presidential election, widely viewed as fraudulent. The US and many other countries refused to recognize Maduro's victory in the years since the relationship remained frozen. The US maintains sanctions and continues to criticize Venezuela's government as authoritarian, while Caracas accuses Washington of attempting regime change and waging economic warfare. At the same time, geopolitical shifts, such as the global energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have prompted some limited dialogue. The US has shown interest in easing sanctions if Venezuela takes steps towards fair elections, and Venezuela has occasionally signaled willingness to negotiate, but mutual distrust runs deep. In essence, what began as a pragmatic oil-based partnership unraveled into an ideological and geopolitical confrontation. The US sees Venezuela as a failed authoritarian state aligned with its global rivals, while Venezuela portrays the US as an imperialist aggressor seeking to dominate its politics and resources. Unless Venezuela undergoes major political reforms, the relationship is unlikely to return to its earlier state of cooperation. And regarding the actions of the Trump administration, we most likely won't see that happen anytime soon.